Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us over your lunch hour to learn about a topic that is at the forefront of our minds right now at EDC, which is protecting our Central Coast region from dangerous oil development. My name is Maggie Hall, and I'm the Deputy Chief Counsel at EDC. I will cover the current administration's latest attack on our coast, which is opening the Pacific to new oil and gas leasing. After that, EDC staff attorney Jeremy Frankel will give you the latest update on Sable Offshore Corporation's efforts to restart oil drilling off Gaviota. We will leave time at the end for questions, so please feel free to enter them into the chat as we go, and we'll do our best to address them at the end. So as most of you know, EDC is a public interest, nonprofit environmental law firm, and our mission is defending nature and advancing environmental justice on California's Central Coast through advocacy and legal action. And opposing and protecting our coast from the threat of offshore oil has been central to our work ever since we were founded. You may have seen the news that the Trump administration is proposing to open up California's coastline to new oil development, and this would be for the first time since 1984. That effort starts with what is called a 5-year leasing program. Earlier this year, one of the federal agencies that oversees offshore oil drilling, called BOEM, or the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, announced it was developing a new leasing program. And the first draft proposed program came out on November 24th. For context, this leasing program falls in the first step of the 4 stages to oil production under federal law, the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act. After the leasing program, it would be followed by lease sales, followed by exploration, and finally development and production. So overall, the program includes new oil drilling in 3 out of the 4 regions in the United States. These include the Gulf, Alaska, and the Pacific, with a schedule of 34 lease sales to begin as early as the year 2027. And these maps show all of the leasing areas that are currently included in the proposed program. Unfortunately, and over the objection of EDC and thousands of commenters, including scientists, NGOs, as well as local governments, the draft program does include the Pacific, and it includes 6 lease sales to occur in the years 2027, 2029, and 2030, with 3 of those lease sales to occur in our region, which is designated as the Southern California program area. So where are we in the process? The whole process started with what's called a request for information on this concept, and that was issued, and EDC submitted a comment on behalf of a group of other organizations during which we opposed the leasing program and requested that the Pacific be excluded from consideration of any new oil drilling. And that 40-day comment period concluded, and then in November, the proposed program was announced, which involves a 60-day comment period, which is where we are now. So during this 60-day comment period, EDC is working with a broad coalition of organizations from across the country to draft a national group letter. And we're also submitting our own regional letter focusing on issues regarding the Pacific. Another important part of this process is urging other regional governments and entities to adopt their own resolutions to oppose any new drilling in the Pacific, which we're working on right now as well. So after the 60-day comment period, there will be a second and third analysis that will be circulated before a final program can be approved, which is anticipated to be by November 2026. But the good news is that this plan can change at any point during the process. And so there's still hope if we act before the program is finalized. So I want to take a step back and highlight why this all matters. It's really important to remember the history of oil production in our region. In 1896, the first offshore drilling occurred in the world right here off Summerland. And then when the technology was developed to go further offshore, the platforms we see today were installed. And that was between the years 1967 and 1989. These platforms are located in federal waters, all approximately 4 to 10 miles offshore. Today, there are 23 platforms in Southern California, and 19 of those are in the federal waters in the Santa Barbara Channel. 5 of the platforms that are identified in yellow on this map are already slated for decommissioning in the near future, and those include 3 platforms off Cornel Guayo and Grace and Gale off Carpinteria. So, of course, we all know that it didn't take long before the first major disaster occurred. In 1969, the well blowout at Platform A in Santa Barbara sent an estimated 3 million gallons of crude oil into the Pacific Ocean, devastating wildlife, marine ecosystems, and tourism. And it really gave rise to the modern day environmental movement. And in 2015, an oil pipeline ruptured and spilled crude oil onto Refugio State Beach. And we're referring to this spill as the Plains oil spill after the oil company that caused this event, which really devastated our local environment and our economy, which Jeremy will get into in more detail. So what these spills have reminded us is that there's no safe way to drill for oil. And this is especially important in such a diverse and sensitive environment. The Santa Barbara Channel is known as the Galapagos of North America for its incredible biological diversity. It provides key habitat for blue, fin, and humpback whales, sea otters, sea turtles, and more than 500 fish species. It's also home to many specially designated places like the Channel Islands National Park, 2 national marine sanctuaries, and marine protected areas. All of these resources are threatened by new oil drilling. The program creates significant risks for our state's environment, tourism and recreation, economy, and quality of life. For example, oil spills threaten long-lasting harm to wildlife, coastlines, fisheries, and could result in extensive economic damage. There's also impacts to air quality, water quality, and noise pollution. For example, seismic blasts used for exploration harms marine life, including whales and dolphins. Wildlife is also threatened by vessel strikes due to increases in traffic and the potential for the increased spread of invasive species. And it's important to remember that we're in a climate crisis right now. And unfortunately, this program would only take us backwards to more reliance on dirty fossil fuels at a time where we really should be transitioning to more responsible forms of energy production. And the administration is doing all of this while skipping the environmental analysis provided for under the National Environmental Policy Act. Before this program, federal agencies had prepared an environmental impact statement for every prior offshore leasing program going back to the very first one was published in 1980. And this really matters because an EIS would involve looking at alternatives to the project, which is supposed to really inform public decision making. So in our comments, we will be critiquing BOEM's program for failing to adequately consider the factors that it must look at under federal law when developing a leasing program. These factors are set forth under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, Section 18A, and we will be focusing on the factors that relate to impacts to the Pacific region. So what can you do? We would encourage you to submit your own comment letter to BOEM by January 23rd, 2026, and we will be submitting or emailing everybody the details on how to do so. If you have any contacts at local governments, we'd encourage you to urge them to adopt their own resolutions opposing any new oil drilling. And finally, because there will be no public forum for individuals to comment directly to the agency during any kind of in-person event, we will be providing our own event, which is called a people's hearing, likely to occur at UCSB in Santa Barbara during the evening of January 16, 2026. And now I'll hand it over to EDC staff attorney, Jeremy Frankel.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Jeremy. Thank you, Maggie. And I'm going to talk about a little bit about the Sable case that we're working on, which is perhaps our most public case, at least right now. And I know all of y'all are hopefully following along and have some questions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the background leading up to Sable and the Plains oil spill in 2015. are concerns regarding Sable's proposal to bring back offshore drilling to the Gaviota Coast, and in part by using the same defective pipeline that spilled in 2015. And then a little bit about how we, on behalf of our clients, are opposing Sable's restart plans. And just so you all know, we are representing a number of organizations in the Sable case, including Get Oil Out, Santa Barbara County Action Network, our local chapter of the Sierra Club, Santa Barbara Channel Keeper, and EDC. And we're also working as part of a broader coalition on the issue as well, statewide. Next slide, please, Maggie. So just to orient us a little bit, what you see here is a map of the San Ynez unit, which is the oil and gas production unit that Sable is attempting to restart. So offshore in federal waters, you can see the three platforms. This is Hondo, Heritage, and Harmony, and these were installed by Exxon way back in the 1980s and have long been owned by Exxon as well. You can also see through the state waters there that there's a subsea pipeline that connects those platforms to a couple processing facilities in Las Flores Canyon. And this is just a little bit up 101 from Santa Barbara, kind of just past El Capitan. I'm not sure if you can see it well on the map, but just right there on the Gaviota Coast. And then from there, once the oil is processed, historically it was transported through this pipeline called the Las Flores Pipeline System. And as you can see on the map, the initial part of it kind of traverses the coast here for about 10, 11 miles. And then it goes inward and it goes inland all the way to Kern County. So the whole pipeline is about 120 miles long. And it goes through Gaviota State Park, a number of wildlife reserves, three major rivers, and a suburban area in Buellton, California. And so this pipeline system was for a long time owned by Plains. Everything else has historically been owned by Exxon. Next slide, please, Maggie. So on May 9th, as I'm sure you all remember, 2015, that pipeline I was just talking about ruptured inland of Highway 101 at Refugio State Beach. And it went through a culvert under the highway and actually spilled, onto the beach and into the surrounding Pacific Ocean. So EDC staff were notified of the spill and immediately went to the beach. And actually, I was not a member of EDC at the time, but was camping there with some buddies and was evacuated shortly after the spill. So a lot of us here have, a personal memory of the spill itself. And you can see some of the statistics that we've put in here. It was, one of the largest spills in California history. Some estimates have put it at about 400,000 gallons, and it did spread as far as Redondo Beach, 150 miles away. The total cost to Plains, which was the owner at the time, is now upwards of $800 million, most recently today. And just really quick, what's important here is that the cause of the spill was progressive corrosion of this pipeline. It basically corroded to the point where it was so thin that it couldn't withstand the pressure of the oil and it just ruptured. And the reason for that is the technology intended to prevent that corrosion. It doesn't work on these pipelines, and it still doesn't. And just by design, it can't. So next slide, Maggie. So a little bit of background before we get into Sable, but without the pipeline, there was this interim period of, close to a decade where there was no way to transport oil from the San Ynez unit. So those platforms shut down and were, shut in. And there was a couple strategies to try to, resume transportation of the oil. And the first was employed by Exxon to actually truck oil from its processing facilities inland towards Kern County. And they sought, permits from the county to do that. And we were involved in those proceedings. We presented, extensive evidence about the risks of oil spills along the truck route, especially up 166, and actually prevailed. The county denied those permits. Exxon sued the county we intervened and we prevailed in court. So the trucking issue was put to bed. At the same time, Plains actually submitted an application to build a brand new pipeline because of the defective nature of the existing one. But shortly after 2020, I think 2022, Exxon purchased the pipeline system from Plains. So now everything was owned by Exxon. And then shortly after that, Exxon sold everything to Sable Offshore Corp. And Sable is a speculative Texas-based company that was formed solely to try and restart the San Ynez unit and this pipeline system. And these are Sable's only assets. This is everything that they own. So, some of the things that we're concerned about with Sable here are, first of all, the pipeline. It's a defective pipeline, and it's not really a matter of if it's going to spill again, but when. And there is an analysis that the county commissioned that suggests a spill could happen once a year and a major rupture every 4 if the pipeline's brought back online. And then compounding that risk are a couple things. Really, that Sable itself is not proven to be a trustworthy or reliable operator. And we'll get into this a little bit more, but it has this pattern of practice of ignoring really critical environmental laws and also agency directives. It's also underfunded. And so that presents issues regarding, can we trust them to be able to financially clean up a spill, remediate a spill, and if necessary, abandon all of these facilities, which is hundreds of millions of dollars. And then, of course, there's also the climate impacts, which Maggie was talking about, of bringing these facilities back online. This particular project, the SYU, was the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in our county when it was active. And in fact, bringing it back online would double the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we have. Next slide. So, this is a really large and complex case. It involves over a dozen agencies, nearly a dozen lawsuits at this point, and EDC has been engaged in some capacity in pretty much every agency process that's relevant here. And it's, for that reason, been a very resource-intensive case for us. We've had our entire legal team working on this issue, in addition to our other staff, to execute public outreach and engage with media, do on-the-ground surveys of the pipeline system. So with that in mind, I'm just going to highlight, I think, 3 matters that really give a good picture of what we've been up to and our successes over the last year. Next slide. So starting with the Coastal Commission, and hopefully you guys were following the news because this was in the news for months between 2024 and 25. But in order to restart this pipeline system, Sable needs to do extensive repairs because of how corroded it is. And just on that coastal portion, so that 11 miles on the coast, there's over 100 repairs that Sable had to do. So they went out and they started doing these massive excavations all along the pipeline route to do these repairs. And they were doing them in really sensitive areas, places like Arroyo Hondo, for example, in other, creek beds and in other really sensitive places along the coast. And they were doing this all without any oversight and without the proper permits. So we alerted a lot of different agencies, including the Coastal Commission, who then proceeded to issue a series of cease and desist orders saying, Sable, you need to stop the work until you get the proper permits, and we're making sure you're mitigating, as much as possible. Sable ultimately ignored those cease and desist orders. So we did go out and do some extensive reporting on the scope of Sable's work, the environmental harm that they were causing on the ground, surveying the entire pipeline route. And we submitted that evidence to the commission and other agencies as well. And in April of this year, this kind of all came to a head, and the commission held a hearing here in Santa Barbara regarding how to address Sable's noncompliance. So they did, as you can see on the screen here, the hearing resulted in a number of things. They relied heavily on the evidence that we submitted and issued Sable a historic $18 million fine, the largest in agency history, a permanent cease and desist order, and a remediation order as well. Sable did challenge all of this in court, and in October, the court kind of issued an initial ruling upholding the fine, the cease and desist order, etc. And it also issued an injunction preventing further repairs until Sable gets the proper permits. And importantly, this is just one consequence of Sable's unpermitted work. As I noted, we did submit this evidence to other agencies as well, who issued their own notices of violation, like the Regional Water Board, Fish and Wildlife, some of which Sable also ignored. So there's also a lawsuit filed by the Attorney General addressing violations of the Fish and Game Code. And then, as you may have seen, a criminal complaint, felony complaint as well against Sable, close to 30 charges for violations of the Water Code and Fish and Game Code as well, all related to this unpermitted work that it was doing. Next slide. So one of the other major agencies involved here is the Office of the State Fire Marshal, and this is the agency that's responsible for overseeing pipeline safety in the state of California. And so because of the defects in the pipeline that I was talking about earlier, that the corrosion prevention technology doesn't work on these pipelines, they need waivers to be excused from certain laws to actually restart the pipeline system. And they need to get these waivers from the Office of the State Fire Marshal. So this office did actually issue the waivers. They were finalized in February of this year. They did so without any public process and without doing any environmental review regarding the possible effects of restarting the pipeline system. So we did file a lawsuit in April challenging those waivers, in part for not having a public process or doing environmental review. And in May, Sable announced that it had restarted production offshore. And we were very worried that it was going to imminently start the pipeline system as well. So we did file and won a temporary restraining order that prevented for 6 to 8 weeks Sable restarting the pipeline system. And then later the court partially granted our request to enjoin Sable from restarting as our lawsuit continues. And the lawsuit is ongoing. We are still kind of in the preliminary stages. I know litigation takes a long time, but that's kind of where we're at right now. And yeah, so next slide, Maggie. And then the last kind of item I just want to point out here is the work we've been doing in front of Santa Barbara County. So the county has this kind of unique ordinance here. It's called Chapter 25B. And what it's intended to do is, this was passed in the early 2000s to put some guidelines for major operators like Exxon who want to transfer their oil and gas assets to minor speculative companies like Sable, because that presents a lot of issues for the county. Is this new company, can they be trusted to safely operate? Do they have the financial capacity to remediate a spill? Things like that. So Chapter 25B requires the county to review and approve the transfer of certain oil and gas permits, and Sable needs approval from the county to transfer permits that Exxon currently has to Sable. And these are permits for some of the onshore facilities, which are under the county's jurisdiction. So again, some of the things the county considers here are really mainly, does this entity have the financial and operational capacity to responsibly and safely operate? So late last year, this went before the Planning Commission, and despite a huge turnout in opposition, they did approve the transfer 3-1. We appealed that to the board, and in February, had another crack at it. We presented extensive evidence regarding Sable's precarious financial situation and a pattern of disregarding, important environmental laws, and the county board ended in a 2-2 vote, which was a little controversial. Sable sued, claiming that the 2-2 meant the Planning Commission decision stood. We intervened in the lawsuit. we argued that the 2-2 meant there was no decision, that the permit transfers were not approved, and the court actually agreed with us recently in September, and they sent it back to the county to try to reach a majority. So we returned in November, about a month ago, and the board this time voted 4-1 to deny the transfer of permits to Sable. And we actually were able to flip a typically pro-oil supervisor based on the evidence that we submitted, Supervisor Lavanino. So it does return one last time on December 16th to the board to finalize that vote. And it's really important that we get a huge turnout there. We need a lot of support for the board. That's December 16th. So please keep your eyes peeled for an action alert about that. Next slide. So where are we at now? And I kind of want to just highlight three things that Sable still needs, putting aside everything we just talked about. These are kind of the three major things that Sable still needs to actually restart this pipeline system that it doesn't have yet. So this is just a kind of a quick look of where Sable stands today. So first, in addition to those waivers I was talking about from the fire marshal's office, they actually need final approval as well to actually restart the pipeline system. And the fire marshal has final say over that. And recently, it told Sable that it would actually have to do additional repairs before it would grant its approval for restart. And as you might remember, as I just said, they currently can't conduct those repairs due to a court-ordered injunction. So kind of in limbo there. They also need an easement from our state parks because the pipeline goes through Gaviota State Park. So for decades, the pipeline was operated pursuant to an easement granted by state parks, but that expired shortly after the spill. They need a new easement to actually resume operations through the park. And so they've requested that easement, and they also requested that state parks exempt the easement from environmental review. A few weeks ago, State Park said that they would not grant that exemption. So the process is still underway, but it will be significantly longer without that exemption and hopefully result in some amount of environmental review. And then lastly, we worked closely over the last year with Assemblymember Hart to introduce AB 1448. And this was a bill that requires a new coastal development permit to restart defunct oil infrastructure in the coastal zone, which would ensure, additional environmental review. That bill was incorporated into legislation introduced by Gavin Newsom called SB 237. And the key provisions we had in Hart's bill did pass. It takes effect on January 1st, so if Sable has not restarted by the 1st, they will also be subject to this new requirement and have to get a CDP from the Coastal Commission to restart. Next slide. So a couple just really recent developments. Sable is, running out of time, they're running out of money, and frankly, they've been getting beat by us at every turn. And so now they're appealing to the Trump administration in a couple different ways. The first relates to this impasse with the fire marshal's office that's come up. They're trying to really circumvent the agency, and they've asked the federal government, an agency called PHMSA, to take over jurisdiction of the pipelines from the state of California and grant restart approval. They issued a letter to that agency a couple of weeks ago. There hasn't been a response from them yet. But really importantly, in 2016, there was what's called a memorandum of understanding between the feds and our state fire marshal's office that specifically recognized that this is a intrastate pipeline system, and so it's only subject to state jurisdiction. And on top of that, even if Sable was able to get this jurisdiction transferred over this pipeline system, they would still need other approvals to restart, like the easement I just mentioned and the CDP potentially. And then lastly, and I think this is kind of front and center on a lot of folks' minds, Sable announced this plan to bypass the state entirely by installing something called an OS&T, or offshore storage and treatment vessel. And it's basically a floating processing plant out there by the platforms in federal waters that would process oil, and barges would come up and take it away. So this is something that could be basically the size of a football field, and there would be regular barge traffic coming up and taking oil away. So again, that entire operation, as they're proposing, would be in federal waters. And they've submitted plans to BOEM, the agency Maggie was talking about, to get approval to install this OS&T vessel. But they really face this kind of complex patchwork of regulatory approvals, each of which could be subject to challenge. They're basically starting, a whole new massive project. And whether they can get those approvals is certainly an uncertainty. There's still some amount of state and local oversight. But even if they could, they likely need hundreds of millions of dollars in additional financing, and it's just not clear right now where that would come from. So we are, skeptical of the feasibility of this proposal, both legally and practically. But we haven't had any real updates in the last couple months. They submitted this plan back in October, and we are continuing to monitor it. And the next slide, and our last slide, and I just want to recognize that, we are not working alone here. We are part of a broad coalition of NGOs and tribes and concerned individuals. We have been working very closely with our state representatives, Greg Hart and Monique Limon, who are actually conveniently pictured here, just to the right of Linda, our chief counsel, and also our federal representatives, Salud Carbajal and Senator Schiff. And not to mention also a couple high-profile friends pictured here, Jane Fonda, and a lot of support from Julia Louis-Dreyfus as well. Next slide. So that concludes our presentation today. And if you'd like to, stay updated on Sable and the leasing plan, please make sure you sign up for updates on our website. You will get our action alerts, you will get our updates, you'll get our newsletter. And I think one more slide. And we are ready to take any questions that you guys might have.
Thanks, Jeremy and Maggie. That was wonderful. We have a few questions already here, but just to remind folks, you can use the little Q&A section in the bottom menu and drop in a question, and we will try to get to as many as we can. And if not, we can always follow up with you afterwards. So while we're on this, Jeremy, this question's for you, hoping that you can just explain a little bit more about the cathodic protection system and why it doesn't work, but the fire marshal still requires them.
Yeah, so let me preface this by saying I'm not a chemical engineer, but I do have a basic understanding. So basically, this pipeline system is buried and insulated. So number one. So generally, these types of pipelines have this system that prevents corrosion on the pipeline called cathodic protection. And what it does is it introduces a current, an electric current along the pipeline system that basically draws corrosion cells away from the pipeline and onto a different piece of metal nearby called a sacrificial anode. And the way that this pipeline is designed, specifically the way it's insulated and coated, that electric current doesn't effectively reach the wall of the pipeline. So it's not doing anything to prevent corrosion, basically. Very simply, high level.
Great, thanks. Maggie, regarding the offshore leasing plan, there was a question about President Biden's permanent protection that he did for the East and West Coast when he was in office, and what's going on with that and how that plays into the new plan.
Great question. So, as many of you might recall, when former President Biden actually withdrew areas of the Pacific from consideration for leasing. So, under federal law, the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act is the law that sets forth the process for oil and gas drilling and production. And there's a provision in that law called 12A that says the president may from time to time withdraw consideration of certain areas for potential leasing. And Biden exercised that authority, withdrew the Pacific, and then when Trump came into office, attempted to revoke that withdrawal. So that question of does the Trump administration have the legal authority to revoke a formal presidential withdrawal under 12A of OXLA is currently being litigated. And there's one lower court case out of Louisiana that has come out, and there's two more cases that are about to come out. But our view under our reading of the statute is that it is not lawful for Trump to revoke that former withdrawal. So right now the area is in flux, but we are confident that that Biden withdrawal should still stand.
Great. Next question is, how does Trump's plan to open our coast to more oil production impact Sable, if at all?
Yeah, so in short, it kind of doesn't directly impact Sable. What Trump is proposing is to open up new leasing in potentially in the Santa Barbara Channel. These are existing leases that date back to the 80s that are owned by Sable. So it doesn't really have a direct impact on Sable. Maggie, do you have anything to add there?
That's correct. I mean, the only high level connection is just, more oil drilling in the Santa Barbara Channel is something we don't want to see. We want to be, shifting to renewable resources. So, the platforms that Sable operates have been offline for over 10 years now. So while we don't want to allow any new leasing, we also don't want to see the restart of those platforms. But Jeremy's correct that those are part of the old leasing infrastructure, and the last thing we need is yet more leases in the channel.
Great. On the resolutions, there's a question wondering if Santa Barbara County has approved a resolution on the leasing plan so far.
So Santa Barbara County has spoken up at the earlier stage during the request for information, and I believe is planning to move forward with a new resolution at this stage. We don't have the exact dates of that at this point, but if we do get a date, we're happy to circulate that so that folks can chime in and go to the Board of Supervisors and thank them for their efforts.
Wonderful. And regarding the process, another question for you, Maggie. If a leasing event takes place, what options are available for review or cancellation of the lease in the next administration?
So that's a great question. It's all very up in the air as to, the leases are prescribed under this plan. That doesn't mean that the leases will definitely occur. So we can't speak too much about what will happen going forward and what the next administration will bring. But we do know that now is our chance to raise all of our concerns about these issues as a legal matter before this 5-year leasing framework even goes into place so that we can get ahead of that and try to prevent even the establishment of any new lease sales.
Great. And Jeremy, I'm not sure if you know exactly off the top of your head, but there's wondering if the pipeline goes through Gaviota State Park, where it would cross the Gaviota Canyon.
I'm not exactly sure where, but it's the pipeline itself was installed in the late 80s and early 90s, so it's been there for decades. They're just trying to resume operations with this easement.
Great. And kind of a more general question, maybe for both of you. What level of courts do we deal with when we go to court, and do they respect our laws such that you can get the decisions we want?
That's a bit of a loaded question. I would say that it depends on our case. For example, with Sable, we are in state court here in Santa Barbara County for our fire marshal lawsuit, but we are in federal court, the district court level, for our lawsuit involving the county and Sable. So both federal and state court, and then and Maggie has experience also in front of the Ninth Circuit if we get there, if it gets appealed. So both state and federal.
Anything to add, Maggie?
Yeah, hopefully we don't end up in prolonged litigation on any of these. I think we've had some really early victories in the Sable case along the way, which is great. But I do think, one recent example where the federal government was moving forward with offshore fracking, and that did result in prolonged litigation. Unfortunately, we did prevail both in the district court and at the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. So that's a promising example of the court applying the law and applying the interpretation of the law that we advanced in court.
Great. Jeremy, you mentioned that the greenhouse gas emissions would double if that's why you came back online. And this question is just wondering how if that would prevent the county from meeting our goals or how that would affect our county's goals.
Yeah, off the top of my head, it's hard to remember, and maybe Maggie can add more, but I believe when the county maybe did not account for the onshore facilities when it was introducing its most recent climate action plan. But I think in any event, it would massively affect, our ability to reduce our carbon emissions and hopefully be zero carbon.
Okay, great. Maggie, how can people reach out to provide a comment to BOEM?
So BOEM is receiving comments online, so you can write your own comment letter. There's also some organizations that have created forms that you can submit that makes it really easy to adopt a comment and have it submitted directly to BOEM. We will be sending out an action alert with those details with the links so that you can have those handy as well. So pay attention to your emails for those.
Great. And just to tag on to that, there's a question for more details on the people's hearing that will come as well. But as a reminder, it's on Friday, January 16th, and it's likely to be out at UCSB at 5 p.m. So we'll keep you all posted with that in our action alert as well. And I guess one more question here, and then we should probably wrap up and give you all your final minutes of your lunch hour. But this question is about Governor Newsom and if he has explicitly expressed opposition to Sable as he has for the 5-year leasing plan.
So Governor Newsom's position on this particular project he's been very careful really to not say anything too forward about it. He did, support eventually the legislation that we had introduced with Assemblymember Hart, which was really directed at Sable, but he has not taken an explicit position on the project.
Great. Well, everyone, thanks so much for joining us. This is being recorded, so we will share that as well. And please do stay tuned. Be sure to join our email list and follow us on social media. And thank you all for your time today.
Thank you, everyone.